Welcome to The Edge, a podcast from the Bluntness where we unpack real-world experiences and expertise of seasoned and successful professionals across both legal and legacy cannabis. I'm your host, Harrison Wise, founder and publisher of The Bluntness. Joining us today is Mark Slaugh, founder and CEO of iComply, a cannabis compliance advisory firm that helps operators in becoming and staying compliant with marijuana rules and regulations. Mark, welcome to The Edge.
Hey, thanks, Harrison. Glad to be here.
So let's just start at the top. For those that don't know you or know iComply, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do through your business.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate what you're doing here with the Bluntness, especially in terms of getting the perspectives of both, the regulated market and sort of the legacy market. I actually started back in the day on the legacy side of things back in 2008, 2009 as a caregiver out here in Colorado, back when the federal government said, hey, we're not going to touch this. And so we're somewhat in a gray area. And I was, knocking down walls of my house and growing cannabis up until, MS-13 tagged my fence and warned me that was still their hood. So I've been on a unique perspective of selling kind of cannabis during college, but, never moving major weight, kind of figured that, you're in this weird place where you're either going to piss off the cops or you're going to make the existing illicit market mad. And so I figured if I was going to have any sort of protections that could be outside of my shotguns and pit bulls, that it might make sense to move things forward, in terms of policy and legislation and going legitimate. So I started industry groups back in the day in Colorado and putting together growers and dispensaries, many of which are still around, many of which fell off. And watching the growth of the industry early on when nobody really knew what they were doing and there weren't any rules and regulations yet. Started working for some early brands, some brands that still exist till today and have grown out of Colorado from their little seedling days. But we also, had a lot of challenges, especially at the state level without a lot of rules and regulations. And so you had a lot of people coming from the legacy market into a legitimate marketplace. And even though the game is the same, right? We're growing, we're harvesting, we're processing, we're selling weed. The actual rules are not, right? The rules are completely different in those two worlds. And so I decided, having watched people struggle with things like standard operating procedures and audits. Prior to this, I was also coming from a bank and risk management background, working in compliance and regulations, ironically shutting down dispensaries in California, for selling weed and when they were trying to do credit card processing on weed, that sort of thing. So I kind of had a unique understanding of what needed to be in place to help people kind of transition from the illegitimate market to the legitimate market, and to take those legacy skill sets and to leverage those as strengths and to really embrace a culture of compliance rather than resist it.
Who do you think is doing it right in terms of just states by state? New York, every state's had issues. Many states continue to have issues. New York is probably the more prevalent one right now because it's coming online and there's just issues across the board. And then there's certainly issues for those real legacy operators, right? Not those who were, impacted by the war on drugs and maybe spent a weekend or two in jail for weed possession. These are legacy dealers who have done, serious time, who don't really have a clear path to legalization. So I'm just curious, who do you think is doing it well, or, where is there room for improvement?
Yeah, when you say doing it right, I mean, there's a lot of rules. You're talking about 300, 400, or 500 pages of rules and regulations.
Right.
I assume what you're talking about is the conversion of
Yes.
of legacy into legitimacy.
Yes.
I would say New York's not doing that as great as they could be, right? Because who is coming online after stop and frisk and 10,000 Black youth a day that has audited financials, right? Let alone a business that survived COVID long enough to be able to qualify. So the reality is, like, even if they just increase more licenses, even if they're saying they're going to double them, right? These legacy folks that are already sitting out in New York, many of which were never from New York, never got arrested in New York, but they got an RV sitting on the block, right? And they're selling weed and the cops are doing nothing about it now. It's completely night and day, and it's not fair at all. And I don't think that they've done a great job of the market capture needed, right? Because now you've got these 200-300 licensees that are maybe the most difficult to qualify in the first place, the biggest hurdle to jump with those audit financials and everything else, business experience, etc. Now trying to compete with 1,600, right, in just New York City alone, 1,600 of these illicit operators that are doing delivery services or setting up on the block and selling weed. And they're doing it at $30, $40, $50, $60 an eighth, right? Somewhere in that range, while the hemp growers are still trying to figure out how to harvest. And whatever they're pulling down is not great quality compared to what gets imported from Oklahoma or Colorado or Missouri or California and is being sold down the street. So I think it's a really tough marketplace in the beginning, and it's not truly unlocking the full potential of what legacy could do if it was given a path forward. And so we were working on a lot of policy to try to provide this information and feedback to New York with a lot of other great industry associations. As in my role, it's policy and regulations director over at National Cannabis Industry Association for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, because we do care about that. We think that if you allow people in, if you allow them a pathway and give them the tools and resources, including the money, including the education needed, including things like compliance, you got to learn the new rules for the new game, then you can actually create pathways to success in which you can convert that over and give people the opportunity. But if you never give them the chance in the first place, you're just going to keep seeing the power of that legitimate market. And New York should have learned that lesson from California, right? Because they also didn't let anybody in. And in doing so, right, they really did create a whole other, I think it's 5-1 on illegitimate market sales to legitimate ones.
Well, where do you think that issue stems from? I mean, every state seems to want to go it alone, and they don't seem to learn the lessons of the states that came before it. Like, where does that stem from?
Well, you know, like how every grower thinks they're the best grower.
Oh, of course, yeah. So every state thinks they can do it better than
every politician thinks they're the smartest politician. I'll tell you, like having been the consultant for governments before, back in 2015 to 17, the island of Puerto Rico ended up hiring me. But when I got down there to look at what they put together, man, it was 42 pages of like, you smoke this in front of your kids, you're going to jail type stuff, right? Like, it was draconian, it was bad. And they thought they were meeting like what they needed to. Fortunately, they were humble enough to go, oh, okay, I think I wrote the presentation while I was sitting in the back of their presentation, and went, all right, here's where I'm going to fix it. And then we get up there and deliver this. So I went up and did sort of breakdown of what they said, how it can be improved. And I wasn't necessarily looking for a job. I was just asked to go down there and, hey, maybe help correct this so we don't have a bad marketplace. But that did turn into a unique opportunity to see behind the scenes and the politics. And they joke in Puerto Rico because, they don't have a national sport. So the national sport is politics. And that's the reality. I tell people we're not in the cannabis business. We're in a political and legal business first. Then you're in a compliance and application business. And then you can finally grow and sell weed. And that's kind of rules number 101 of this game. But in Puerto Rico, is a really interesting view to see how much people's hubris came out and how much they think they knew about something they knew nothing about. But especially for politicians, especially for public policy and looking good to the public and avoid looking bad, people put forward a face and they act like they know more than they do. And unfortunately, it has detrimental consequences and does real harm, especially to those that have already been harmed.
Yeah. Actually, I always thought Puerto Rico's national sport was chichando.
I think in the sense of like relating to any other national sport, right?
Oh, you mean professional sports? But I don't know.
They're good at baseball, bro. I can't discount them on baseball. But yeah, it was Puerto Ricans that are like, oh, no tenemos deporte nacional, tenemos política.
That's a different topic for a different podcast. So, pardon my facetiousness on this.
You're right. We're not laughing, we're crying. You know?
Yeah, it's all good. It's my podcast. I guess I could do whatever I want at the end of the day. But so with that said, kind of going back to compliance, are there any states? Well, Puerto Rico's was the example you just gave, but anybody else doing it right, getting that kind of legacy to legal?
Yeah. So I mean, what we did in Puerto Rico is we just said, look, if we have a mandate for 6 months from now to get patients product, they need product in their hand. We can't continue to delay this process. Plus, the politics are about to change over, right? One party was about to take over the other. They had to establish something before the new party got there. I just said, look, if the plants can pass testing, why do we got to start with seeds and clones, right? So what we did is just ramp up this reality that you could convert in fully flowered plants as long as they pass testing. Who cares? What that ended up doing is creating some of the largest illicit operators on the market the opportunity to grow up and bulk up plants for the industry and convert them into metric, right, into BioTrack actually in Puerto Rico, but convert them into the seed to sale system at a later point so that day one they got licensed, day two they were harvesting, And to me, it doesn't matter as long as it passes testing and it's safe for the customer, for the patient. So that's one of the things we kind of did on that level, to convert in legacy and to create those partnerships, because now legacy was bringing something to the table that the legitimate marketplace didn't have or wasn't unable to have. So you have to be able to create value, right? Equitability for them to be able to have that conversation. Otherwise, you get predatory agreements. Otherwise, you get preyed upon. You have all these other problems we've seen. The other thing we did too is make sure that it was owned by folks from the island, right? That we didn't just let in anybody from outside of there to just come in and colonize, especially in a place like Puerto Rico that knows all about colonialism.
Yeah.
That can come in and take that over. And unfortunately, in the cannabis industry, we see a lot of what I call social equity colonialism, right? Where people see this unique opportunity and then they prey upon other people. And we see it from our own social equity folks that are just like, well, I'd rather take the $300,000 and step away anyway. And it's like, but you could have $30 million business, right? On the other side of that. So
only if you have the long game in mind.
So
I think everyone wants those riches, next week, next month, next year. Yeah.
Like, and that's immediacy. And, it's a whole nother conversation about one marshmallow or two marshmallows to kind of experiment. Yeah. But the reality is that I don't think any state has really done it fully right. Everybody's tried a different thing. Mm-hmm. The sad part is, right, we're using social equity as a laboratory rat to try to figure out how to balance out the scales of injustice from many, many years of prohibition. And it is causing some harm in the meantime. But we had high hopes for Illinois. We had high hopes for New York. We had high hopes for these other states. Colorado, where I live, man, it's probably the worst social equity system I've seen. Like, there's no equity. Right. You can get a delivery license and then you get paid like an Uber Eats driver. Like, it's not, there's no buying and selling of cannabis. There's no equity literally in the margins at all for folks out here. So, I don't think anybody's done it fully right. New Mexico also didn't do it right. Arizona, had a very limited number of licensed lottery balls. So it's just, I think we're starting to see, right, the influences of American business and politics, which is the good old boys club, which are the wealth and capitalists and colonizers. Unfortunately start to control this narrative, take this over, divide the community, tokenize people, right? There's a lot of this type of behavior that leads to an unclear message from the social equity side of things that then gets diluted, politicized, right, and otherwise hijacked, so that we end up with sort of these milquetoast systems. I mean, Missouri, they threw in social equity at the end so they could pass the bill. And now their social equity operators aren't allowed to transact with their legitimate market operators. So they just brought back segregation between the markets, right? Your social equity, you got to stay in social equity. You can't grow as much, and you can't transact with, right? That's now that's now voted for in their constitution. It's crazy.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy. And I started reading today, I think, or yesterday, about somebody's proposing that social equity applicants, it might be specific to New York. I bookmarked it so I could come back to it. But the gist was that social equity applicants or licensees should be treated somewhat like nonprofits, so they can reallocate some of that money back into their businesses and grow, versus having to pay all of these taxes and fees and whatnot, which is debilitating for many businesses. But as a maybe a stopgap, perhaps, but as an ability to kind of help them grow and break out of the kind of downward spiral that many of them are in right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the cost of regulation and compliance is huge, and the cost of taxes can be very burdensome. And I think the real challenge is that you've got the wrong market economics, and you are then using social equity to go first, but in a way that's a careful balance, because what do they say, that pioneers discover the land, but like people behind them, then they get arrows in the back kind of thing, because people are going to come in behind them and take that over.
Right.
So it's a challenge on a lot of ways, but you can't send them out there without the loan programs in place, without financing. Right. Because if you have enough deep pockets, you can survive most of that. For sure. Most of that initial turmoil, right? As long as you're not holding properties and paying out of pocket. Like, this is cool that the state's holding these properties to some degree, giving them some leeway and giving them a step up, which is unlike any other state. So I think got to give New York some credit where credit's due. Yeah, but they don't have that. I think they paid some god awful amount, millions of dollars to some firm to manage, right, the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're supposed to bring
the funds.
In financing, which isn't available, right? I think Illinois is just getting theirs. I mean, it's almost too late, and it's
Yeah.
almost right.
And it's hurting a lot of people, and
Yeah.
it's crazy too, because New York is, one of 3 or 4 financial capitals of the world.
Yeah. What I will say they're doing a
Yeah.
good job of is technical assistance. I think they're putting out the right education. They're putting out credible universities with good education and information. That doesn't always translate to it being done at the business. Like you can
Right.
learn about SOPs, but doesn't mean you're writing SOPs for yourself. But that's where we come in or help out if the capability is there. But I think they're doing a good job on trying to do more technical, trying to provide that step up financially, at least with property.
Yeah.
But again, the market dynamics are completely off, and there's no way you're going to limit people to 500 feet of distancing from each other, some ridiculous amount in a city like New York where everything goes up, you know what I mean, and builds vertically upwards, not just outwards.
Right.
And so, I think they've got some real issues because, again, the market dynamics are teetering in the favor of the illicit markets.
No, that's the mark. But what do you think about that idea, though, of treating social equity applicants as like nonprofits to allow them to retain more of their cash flow and profits?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad idea on the surface. I still think that the voters and the politicians still want a piece of that pie. So is that forever? Is that a tax exemption? Do you offer tax credits for things like incubation? Right? There's other ways to look at this, but at some point, part of the motive to legalize is taxation, right? So that we can pay for the offsets of the harm that is caused by legalization in the minds of regulators. Even though we all know that we've been around with cannabis and cars and stuff for a long time, way before there were laws about it. But I think that balancing that out can be somewhat challenging, but. And especially when you're talking about a deficit on the state to operate this for a period of 2-3 years. So the reality is you still have to fund your regulators. Otherwise, the market looks like Oklahoma, right, where they have 13 regulators for 10,000 licenses. That didn't work either. So what ends up happening is you create an unfair marketplace, unfair playing field. So part of the point of legitimacy is that everybody has the same rules. Everybody plays by the same rules, so that there's fair competition. When you start having people not play by those rules, selling off the back door, et cetera, then there's no difference in between that and legitimate market, legitimate or legacy. And so I think the idea is to help create these sort of long-term businesses, things you can pass down to your kids, et cetera, and that's got to be done right, which means you do need some sense of, a referee to the game.
Probably one of the biggest challenges to accomplishing that, though, and we touched on it briefly from a state funding perspective, but it's capital or access to capital, which biggest problem across the board. Where do you think that stems from? Because I come my agency worked in tech for many years. I was part of the original .com boom. Tech gets billions and billions of dollars from the VC community.
Yeah.
What's missing in cannabis from that perspective? Like why isn't there more investment in this space to help those type of businesses grow, scale, and ultimately achieve successful exits and outcomes?
Well, there is if you belong to certain communities or you have certain track records. I would say for people transitioning, there's not a lot of faith and confidence that they're able to operate in the business world. It's a lot of stigmatization. You're asking me a really hundreds of year old question as to why is it unfair in the first place, right? I mean, that's
well, no, not unfair. I guess maybe the question is more as to I know there's capital out there, and I know it's typically with colonizers is the word we've been using so far, but
capitalists, right?
Yeah, but there's also there's tons of wealthy Black and Latino executives, successful people, entertainers, etc. Al Harrington is just one of many examples. Like there is capital, but why is there just this lack of sort of that capital side and the cannabis side, or even from smaller mom and pop type businesses that want to break into the cannabis industry? There's a disconnect.
Yeah, the challenges I've seen is that if you're small mom and pop, then the excuse can often be you're not big enough for an investment, right? So there's that irony that if you're not big enough, you won't get what you're needed to grow.
Right.
And then the other side of that too is that some of the people you mentioned that are transitioning with their own teams, with their own businesses, with their own opportunities for investment, and they may or may not spread that beyond there. And then I'd say the third disconnect is that a lot of times these teams, these folks coming in, don't have trusted consultants or advisors or resources to know what a good deal is or isn't. And so it can make them very hesitant because they don't understand the marketplace. They don't understand what moves and motivates buyers and sellers. You got to consider that even though cannabis has been around for a very long time, the cannabis industry is only 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a baby learning how to crawl.
Mm-hmm.
So New York's been around, what, a year, a few months? I mean, it's not, right?
Yeah.
It's not really that mature. And so people want to see a track record of success too, and make sure that it's going to work. Would you invest in a company that has to sell $80 eighths, right? And is going to get outcompeted 5-1? You know what I mean? So the viability of that investment is all about timing. And so I think that savvy investors that do understand the space get that. A lot of investors don't understand the space, see the federal illegality, see the banking issues, see the tax issues, and don't want to come in. The biggest boys, right, are going to play on their own money. And that's, you're talking about pharmaceutical companies that want into this, tobacco companies, alcohol. I mean, these are biggest distributors in America and across the world that are all making plays in cannabis. But you can see what happened in Canada once they federally legalized it to get a sense of what's going to happen with our capital markets. And the Toronto Stock Exchange ain't nothing like what we have going on Wall Street, right? So I think that day will come, no doubt about it. And it will happen fast and it will happen rapidly. And it's important to position either for exit or for merger acquisition, when you start building your business out day one. But you also need to manage your expectations because this is not easy to do. Then there's a lot of ways of doing cannabis and compliance the wrong way and very few ways of doing it right.
What do you think is the best path forward? I think part of the challenges of even in the capital markets, what we were just discussing is cannabis being treated so differently from tobacco, alcohol, and even other regulated products. How do we overcome that? And I know it's got
to be federally done. And reality is for even social equity, there needs to be a silver bullet at the federal level, right? We couldn't ask like the states to do civil rights movement. We needed a civil rights bill in the 60s. Right. Because otherwise, you still wouldn't be voting in Mississippi if you were Black. Like that's the way it would be. So I think even at a federal level, we need some sort of saving grace, if you will, on like interstate commerce and social equity, right? And we wrote a policy piece on this, and I'm happy to send you the link so you can post it for your viewers on what social equity might look like with regard to interstate commerce, because a lot of people arrested in the war on drugs were just moving product from point A to point B. But you should still have maybe the one up or the leg up on importing or exporting cannabis product and distributing that. So I still think there's an opportunity to kind of do a catch-all on social equity at the federal level when it happens. But to answer your question, our problem is we're not like tobacco. We're not like alcohol in the sense that we have, 40-something different states with 40-something different sets of regulation and rules, right? This is not Canada with 7 provinces and 1 federal law around legalization. We're going to have to figure out what that looks like. And a lot, because of the way we're set up in America with states' rights, what they do in alcohol is somewhat similar, where different states may sell different potencies. So now you have to have a whole different line of products just for that state, right? You may be able to distribute there, but you have these taxes that you're going to have to pay between different states that are different on importing and exporting. So to answer your question, I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon. And we're just making ourselves more of a patchwork quilt of laboratories of democracy that is America in different ways that we're doing cannabis legalization, medicalization, and any combination thereof, which makes my job very challenging to watch that, update materials, right, move different training programs around and make sure that they're up to speed and up to date for that next state, that next application.
If you had the ability to make a like one change tomorrow at the federal level, what would it be? Would it be descheduling? Would it be like, what would it be? What would be the thing that the first priority?
Yeah, I don't, I'm hesitant to just say, let's deschedule it and then watch what happened with hemp in 2018, right? Where then everybody and their mama has a hemp license and we're just buying and selling hemp everywhere without a lot of oversight, without accurate laboratory standards, et cetera. And so there's even now, right, this big fight between non-psychoactive hemp products and then, the actual marijuana that we're seeing legalized and over-regulated versus, right, hemp, which is under-regulated. Right. So I don't even know if that would be the change. You have to deschedule, but with caveats to say this is still, under the purview of the federal government. It won't be interstate commerce until we figure out a system and a regime for that. But that descheduling would, right, remove the tax burden. That descheduling for the existing operators, it would remove some of these other, big challenges that we have on financing, on banking, almost overnight. And so I think, yeah, that would be the move, but with some level of caveat. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Overnight it and expect this not to go crazy if it did. So it's got to be like the toothpaste has got to come out the tube in a controlled way.
Yeah. So if you could go back to the beginning, like what would be a thing that you would change in terms of just cannabis legalization overall?
Not excluding felons and people that were legacy.
Elaborate on that a little bit more.
Oh, no. Yeah. Most of the states that started off legalization have the biggest brands. Name a big brand. They started with a situation where they never had to compete against people who already got busted for cannabis.
Right.
That's all. I mean, we're right. It's only 10-year-old industry. For half of that time, we didn't allow people that had gotten in trouble for cannabis to participate in cannabis.
Yeah.
Right. I would also say that we look back and we realize that things like forcing vertical integration on people, right? Mm-hmm. Shotgun marriages was probably not a great idea because that ended up in a lot of shotgun divorces. Yeah, I mean, hindsight's 2020. It's one of those things where it's the best advice you can never use. You know what I mean? And so I think that's why we're successful as a compliance company, is because we're able to take the lessons learned from the past, right, and model out what the future looks like. I joke, but in a lot of ways, living in more mature markets means you live a little bit more in the future, and you can kind of see what's coming. Right. Hopefully warn people coming into new markets, or expanding from existing markets elsewhere, or maturing in their own market to get a little bit of a heads up, right? I'm going to probably head to Europe here for ICBC coming up. And I think that Europe is a good example of where we have lessons to learn from them.
Sure.
They have lessons to learn from us with their international commerce, right? Which will become our interstate commerce. Right. And we have domestic distribution models that they're completely missing. Right. And so they're even some level of gray market. But it's those types of things that I think are so important to just absorb, learn, and continue to model as we, build not only here in the United States, but eventually internationally, right? Sell Humboldt weed in Amsterdam and vice versa.
Yeah, that's awesome. What you brought up international markets. Honestly, I'm not that focused on external markets, but I do hear a lot about Thailand, Colombia, Germany, and other markets. Sure. What are you seeing out there, and how do you keep your finger on the pulse of all that's happening elsewhere?
Yeah, there's a lot of great publications that can help keep your finger on the pulse. I also have network and allies in Europe and South America, clients that I've worked with. I've spoken at various conferences across Colombia and Panama and other places in Latin America. It helps when you speak Spanish and Portuguese to be able to do that. And Brazil is definitely one of the big fish that people are looking at down there in terms of getting cannabis to a very large marketplace. So I think that there's, compliance interwoven throughout all of that, right? And one of the conversations we're not having here in the U.S. is like around GACP and GMP standards, which is good manufacturing practices, good agricultural practices. So the international community, looks at the golden standard, which is EU GMP compliance for Europe. And that's the level you have to meet, which means stability studies on your product. So if you're producing in Colombia, but you want to sell in Germany, right? Those are two different clients. So what's or two different climates, I should say. So what's the stability between those two regions? So even though Colombia may be able to produce at, say, 5 cents, 15 cents, 50 cents a gram of cannabis, by the time they're done sort of processing that or producing a product that can be shelf stable, labeled, packaged correctly in German, right? There's this whole world of extraneous compliance that I find fascinating because my brain's just weird like that. But it's also one that, we're not having that conversation here in the US because it doesn't apply to us yet. But if you're making a legacy business and you want to invest in that for the next 50 years, you have to anticipate that eventually we'll be selling there. So what's the cost going to be for most operators here to retrofit their hemp operation that converted into New York into a grow to be able to sell New York weed to Europe across the ocean, if that's the case in the future, or even up to Canada if they're not meeting the standards they need to. And what I've seen is a lot of pain in South America trying to convert that over, right, in pesos, and to create a compliant facility and pay for that compliance later, where you have to shut down operations, retrofit all your stuff, right, versus building it right the first time, right? But of course, that's a business decision. It depends on resources, et cetera, et cetera. But I think savvy investors That certainly in applications like we're writing right now for Florida, those are things we're writing into the application because we're anticipating that. And that's, that's where the biggest players are playing is out of Florida, because you have a massive vertically integrated license, no social equity, very challenging marketplace. But I think also one that, they're not messing around on those merit-based points to win those licenses.
Right. What you mentioned a good point about kind of doing it right the first time. What would be your advice to applicants or new licensees that you either encounter through iComply or what have you? Like what's one thing like you wish they knew before they either applied for their license or got their license from a compliance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can't emphasize it enough, but it's to go. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but you'd be surprised. Like, take compliance seriously and be proactive. It's not something you should be reacting to when you get caught. And that's what I'm saying about a culture of compliance. It's so important to change that mindset where it's like you're not hiding what you're doing wrong anymore, or in general, right? Because that just lacks integrity. And if somebody shines a flashlight on your shadows or looks in your file cabinet, that's not a good day, right? You're going to get fined thousands of dollars. You could lose your license. It's very painful when you have to react to non-compliance. And the reality is that it's challenging, it's difficult, it's boring. Nobody really wants to do it. But if you do it right in the first place and set up your systems and protocols to manage compliance, then it doesn't manage you, right? And then you're able to put yourself in a proactive position and see what's coming, right? This is better to avoid the iceberg than to hit it. Yeah. So that's the conversation I wish people would have more often. What I normally hear, though, Harrison, is like, oh, I'm compliant, I got this. And it's like this. And I've never in 12 years of business and 13 years, 14 years, or whatever it is at this point doing this, I've never walked into a place that's 100% compliant. There's always something. So being able to measure your compliance, manage it is extremely important, right? You want to look out over the crow's nest and see if there's icebergs and then steer the ship. It doesn't seem that complicated, but for a lot of people, it's just denial that they have any problems. They feel confident about it and they have it checked out and they're doing it. Or maybe they never got in trouble, or maybe they have a good relationship with their regulator because cops are nice, right? That's what they do. And so there's just a lot of, I think, misnomer about what compliance means. We hear it all the time in the industry as a buzzword, but once you start unpacking it, it's a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult than people realize. And it's really just a world of risk mitigation, but how do you implement those systems and ensure that they're working at all times?
Awesome. Well, Mark, it was great chatting with you today. Any last minute thoughts you want to impart before we wrap things up?
No, I thank you for having me. It was a good conversation and very good insights and things to talk about. So I know we kind of hit all over the place. I'm happy to come back anytime and talk about anything in more specifics if you'd like.
Awesome. Well, Mark Slaugh, thanks for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you.
You as well. Thank you.